evening and welcome to Lesson 1.3, Properties. Let's begin with our essential question. How can you use properties of operations to solve problems? Well, throughout this lesson we're going to learn exactly how to do that. And you can use the properties of operations to help you evaluate numerical expressions more easily. So let's take a look at a couple of the properties of operations that we're looking at. First, there is the commutative property of addition, which states if the order of add-ins changes, the sum stays the same. For example, if we have 12 plus 7, that's going to equal the same sum as 7 plus 12. Then we have the associative property of addition, which means if the grouping of add-ins changes, the sum stays the same. For example, if we look over here, we see 5 plus parentheses 8 plus 14 parentheses. And if we add that together, even though we have the 8 plus 14 grouped, it's going to give us the same sum as if we move the parentheses around the 5 and the 8 plus 14. And then we have the identity property of addition, and that is the sum of any number and 0 is that number. For example, anything that we add to 0 is always going to equal that other number. As we can see, 13 plus 0 equals 13. And then we also have our properties of a multiplication. And we also have a commutative property of multiplication, which says if the orders of factors changes, the product stays the same. And it works the same way as the commutative property of addition. For example, if we have 4 times 9, our product is going to equal the same thing as 9 times 4. We also have the associative property of multiplication, which says if the grouping of factors changes, the product stays the same. For example, if we look over here, we have our 11 times parentheses 3 times 6 parentheses, and if we solve that and get our product, our answer is going to be the same as moving our parentheses around the 11 times 3, then times 6. And lastly, we have the identity property of multiplication. And this one is just a little bit different than that identity property of addition. The identity property of addition says the sum of any number and 0 is that number. Well, the identity property of multiplication says the product of any number and 1 is that number. For example, if we look over here, we see that 4 times 1 equals 4. Now, let's take a look at our Unlock the Problem. Our Unlock the Problem says, the table shows the number of bones in several parts of the human body. What is the total number of bones in the ribs, the skull, and the spine? Well, let's look for some key words there, because it says what is the total? And we know that anytime we see the word total, we should be, and it's listing pieces like the skull, the spine, and the ribs, we know that we are going to add those together. So, the sum of add-ins using mental math, you can use the commutative and associative properties. So, we're going to use properties to find 24 plus 28 plus 26. So, we have our 24 plus 28 plus 26 equals the same thing as 28, 24 plus 26. Doing it that way, we have used the commutative property to reorder the add-ins. So then we have equals 28 plus parenthesis 24, and the only add-in we have left is the 26 parentheses. Doing it that way, we have used the associative property to group the add-ins. So we know that 28, which is the number we brought down, plus the 24 plus 26 we have in parentheses, which equals 50. And that's to use mental math to add. So we know that 28 plus 50 equals 78. So there are 78 bones in the ribs, the skull, and the spine. Now we look at another property of operations, and that is the distributive property. Multiplying a sum by a number is the same as multiplying each add-in by the number and then adding the products. For example, if we look over here, we see 5 times 7 plus 9 equals 5 in parentheses times 7 parentheses plus 5 times 9. So we're basically just distributing it out, just as if you would be giving each one of the add-ins its own gift of 5. So we would look at it 5 times 7, because we've distributed a 5 to the 7, and then we add, and then we distribute a 5 to the 9. 5 times 9. So the distributive property can also be used with multiplication and subtraction. For example, 2 times parentheses 10 minus 8 parentheses minus 2 times 10 parentheses minus parentheses 2 times 8. Now let's look at a couple of more examples. So one way is to use addition. So we know that 8 times 59 equals 8 times 50 plus 9. So using the distributive property, we have 8 times 50 plus 8 times 9. And we know that 8 times 50 equals 400 plus 8 times 9 equals 72. And we add those together and we would equal 472. Then another way is to use subtraction. And we know that 8 times 59 equals 8 times 50 minus 1. I'm sorry, 8 times 60 minus 1. So 8 times 60 minus 8 times 1 equals 480 minus 8 equals 472. Now let's look at example 2. It says to complete the equation and tell which property you used. So we have 23 times 1 equals 23. And we know that anything multiplied by 1 is the same number, and that is using the identity property of multiplication. And look at B, says 47 times 15 equals 15 times 47. And the property we used in that one is the commutative property of multiplication. Now I want you to take out your math journals, and you need to copy the notes for the commutative property, the identity property, the associative property, and the distributive property into your math notes. Be sure you draw the pictures out and create all the notes just as they are on the paper. And I will see you tomorrow in class. If you need additional time to copy, be sure you pause the video on this page and get everything copied.